Hey guys, tonight we're exploring something fascinating, something that might make you look at yourself and everyone around you just a little differently. Have you ever wondered why some humans stand tall like ancient trees, while others are smaller, more compact, and closer to the earth? From the towering Cro-Magnon hunters of prehistory to the tiny island dwellers who adapted to survive in scarce environments, our height tells a story, one written in the bones of our ancestors. So before you get too comfortable, take a moment to like and subscribe, but only if you enjoy the type of content that merges myth and mystery. And hey, let us know from where you're watching and what time is it for you right now. It's time now to dim the lights, settle in, and let's cover what we have for tonight. Imagine, for a moment, the earliest humans, long before the concept of civilization, before the whisper of written language, before the flicker of the first fire danced against the walls of a cave. They moved across open plains, barefoot, their shadows stretching thin beneath the prehistoric sun. These were not yet the people we know today. They were explorers of existence itself, learning the world step by cautious step. And in that early world, something as simple as height could decide the difference between life and death. Back then, the earth was not kind. Vast grasslands stretched endlessly, teeming with predators that watched from the edges. Saber-toothed cats, hyenas, larger than any alive today, and packs of wild dogs that could run down almost anything that moved. The early human ancestors, the Australopithecines, and later Homo habilis, were small, fragile creatures compared to the beasts around them. But nature, patient and observant, was already sculpting change. Over countless generations, bodies began to lengthen, legs grew stronger, and the balance between size and survival shifted. Why did height matter? Because vision was power. In the tall grasses of ancient Africa, the ability to see farther wasn't a luxury. It was an advantage written into the very bones of survival. A taller stance meant spotting predators before they closed in. It meant tracking the distant silhouettes of animals on the move. It meant finding food and water before others could. Every inch in height was a small but measurable step toward safety, awareness, and control over the environment. But evolution is never simple. For every advantage, there's a trade-off. Taller individuals needed more energy to sustain themselves. Their bones carried more weight. Their muscles burned more calories. In times of scarcity, and prehistory was full of them, being taller could just as easily be a burden. Shorter individuals, on the other hand, required less to survive. They could conserve energy in lean times, navigate denser terrain, and stay hidden when danger approached. The battle of tall versus short wasn't a rivalry. It was nature experimenting with survival strategies. Picture the world 3 million years ago, the late Pliocene epoch. Africa's climate was shifting. Forests were thinning into open grasslands. The ancestors of humans, once adapted to climbing trees, were learning to walk upright. Bipedalism, the great transformation that would redefine what it meant to be human. Standing on two legs freed the hands for tools. Yes, but it also gave height a new kind of meaning. When a group of early hominins rose from their crouched posture and stood tall, they weren't just adjusting physically. they were changing the way they interacted with the world. The horizon, once a distant mystery, became something they could see, measure, and move toward. Archaeological evidence from footprints preserved in volcanic ash, the famous Letoli footprints in Tanzania, gives us a glimpse into this moment. Two early humans, walking side by side nearly 4 million years ago, left impressions that tell us not only of their upright posture, but also of their height. One stood slightly taller than the other. In those prints, hardened by time, lies the first measurable hint that variation in stature existed even then. They weren't uniform. Nature had already begun weaving diversity into the human form. But height wasn't just a matter of genetics. It was shaped by environment, diet, and behavior. In the early Pleistocene era, as Homo erectus emerged, a species taller and more robust than its predecessors, their bodies reflected the changing challenges of life. They were hunters now, not just scavengers. To chase prey across miles of savanna demanded endurance, long strides, and efficient heat regulation. Taller, leaner bodies radiated heat better, giving Homo erectus the stamina to run under the relentless sun. In those long legs and upright backs, you can almost see the dawn of something distinctly human. Purpose, movement, the rhythm of survival itself. Still, the story of height isn't one of straight progression, it's one of adaptation. Different groups of early humans evolved in different regions, facing unique climates. Some became taller, others shorter, based on what best fit their world. There was no ideal form, there was only what worked. Consider the difference between those who lived in open plains versus those who dwelled in dense forests. The tall, lean bodies of the savanna offered speed and vision, while shorter, more compact builds were better for maneuvering through trees and conserving heat. Height became the mirror of geography. Each generation carried the silent memory of its environment within its bones. What's fascinating is how quickly, in evolutionary terms, these changes could occur. A shift in climate, a new predator, a change in diet, and suddenly, the selective pressures that favored one height over another flipped. Evolution was not building perfection, it was building adaptation in motion. Even in those prehistoric days, we can imagine social effects tied to size. A taller individual may have appeared more dominant, more capable of leadership or protection. These subtle perceptions, even if instinctive, may have influenced mate selection, giving height an additional advantage in reproduction. Over thousands of generations, such patterns could ripple through entire populations. By the time Homo erectus spread from Africa into Asia and Europe, the range of human height was already wide. Fossil evidence from sites in Kenya and Georgia shows individuals nearly 6 feet tall, living alongside others closer to 5 feet. These weren't isolated anomalies. They were part of humanity's natural spectrum. In every campfire, in every migration, humans carried both tall and short forms, each molded by the landscapes they called home. When you look at this deep past, it becomes clear that height was never random. It was a language of adaptation, one that nature wrote with precision and patience. Every increase or decrease in stature had meaning, a reflection of struggle, climate, and need. It's humbling to think that something as everyday as how tall we are carries the echoes of those ancient choices. The very fact that you can reach a shelf or see over a crowd is, in a sense, a gift passed down from those first beings who stood upright under the African sky. Their bones carried the experiments of millions of years, balancing energy, survival, and function until the form we now call human began to take shape. So, when we ask why some humans are taller and others shorter, we're not just asking a biological question, we're asking a historical one, a question written in fossilized footprints and ancient bones. Height mattered from the beginning because adaptation mattered. In those early footsteps, nature wasn't designing beauty or symmetry, it was designing survival. The first footprints weren't just marks on the earth, they were signatures of a species learning to stand, to see, and to move forward. From that first moment of uprightness, height became part of the human story, a measure not of vanity, but of endurance, environment, and the endless experiment of life itself. When we imagine the ancient world, we often think of it as a single, unified story, early humans slowly evolving, each generation taller, stronger, and smarter than the last. But that isn't quite the truth. The prehistoric world was not a straight line of improvement. It was a mosaic, a patchwork of human experiments scattered across continents. Some grew tall, some small, each molded by the land beneath their feet and the air they breathed. It was an age of giants and dwarfs, of extraordinary variation, an evolutionary theater where height was both a weapon and a weakness. Let's begin roughly 2 million years ago, a time when the human family tree had more branches than it does today. Across Africa, Asia, and Europe, several human species coexisted, cousins, not direct ancestors, but each adapted in astonishingly different ways. Some were giants by ancient standards, others miniature marvels of survival. To understand why height varied so dramatically, we must step into their world, a world shaped by extremes. In East Africa, the plains stretched wide beneath the merciless sun. Here lived Homo erectus, tall and athletic, often reaching heights of around 5 feet 10 inches, impressive for a creature of its age. Their bones were dense, their limbs long and powerful. They were built to run, to chase prey for hours in the blazing heat, to outlast rather than outrun. Their height wasn't for show, it was an adaptation, an engineering masterpiece honed by the environment. Long legs meant longer strides, and longer strides meant energy efficiency over great distances. These were the endurance athletes of prehistory, shaped by the savannas. Now, travel eastward, thousands of miles and thousands of years later, to the islands of Indonesia. Here, on the island of Flores, archaeologists discovered something that stunned the world. The remains of a tiny human species, no taller than a modern 3-year-old child. Homo floresiensis, nicknamed the Hobbit, stood barely over 3 feet tall. Their skulls were small, their limbs short, yet their stone tools showed intelligence far beyond their size. They lived in caves, hunted small animals, and survived on an island where food was limited and predators scarce. Why would evolution take such a drastic turn? The answer lies in a phenomenon scientists call island dwarfism. On islands, where resources are finite and competition is fierce, species often shrink over generations. Smaller bodies require less food, mature faster, and can sustain populations longer under scarcity. Nature, in her quiet pragmatism, always seeks balance. For Homo floresiensis, being small wasn't a disadvantage. It was survival perfected for isolation. At the same time, across Europe and Asia, other species evolved along different paths. The robust Homo heidelbergensis, an ancestor to both Neanderthals and modern humans, stood tall and broad, their bodies designed to endure cold and hunt large animals. Their bones tell of immense strength, wide shoulders, thick ribs, powerful limbs. They weren't just tall, they were built like fortresses of flesh and bone, where Homo erectus was built for heat and speed. Homo heidelbergensis was built for endurance and cold, and when temperatures dropped further, this lineage gave rise to one of the most iconic figures in human prehistory, the Neanderthal. The Neanderthals, who roamed Ice Age Europe and Western Asia, were not giants in height. They averaged around 5 feet 5 inches, but they were giants in mass and strength. Their stocky builds, short limbs, and thick chests were evolutionary armor against freezing climates. Every inch of their frame conserved heat. They weren't tall, but they were powerful, capable of hunting massive prey, enduring cold nights, and surviving conditions that would cripple most modern humans. They remind us that height alone doesn't define size. Proportion is just as crucial. Meanwhile, in Africa, where warmth persisted, early modern humans, Homo sapiens, developed a different physique. Tall, slender, and built for long distance movement, their bodies told of an environment where speed and heat regulation mattered most. Compared to their Neanderthal cousins, they looked almost elongated, with narrower hips and longer limbs. The contrast between Neanderthal compactness and early Homo sapiens grace was a study in adaptation. Two human forms shaped by the same earth, but entirely different worlds. This variety wasn't limited to bones and bodies. It extended to lifestyles. Tall species, like Homo erectus, relied on persistence hunting, chasing prey across plains until exhaustion. Shorter species, like Homo floresiensis, mastered ambush and conservation, using strategy rather than speed. Evolution had written multiple answers to the same question: how do you survive when the world is always changing? The age of giants and dwarfs also reveals something profound about how flexible human biology truly is. If you were to place a Neanderthal, a Homo erectus, and a Homo floresiensis side by side, you'd see three completely different shapes, all unmistakably human. Yet they thrived in their respective environments for hundreds of thousands of years. That's not accident, that's adaptability, the true genius of our lineage. Let's pause for a moment and imagine these beings not as museum skeletons, but as living, breathing individuals. The tall Homo erectus, striding confidently through the savanna, scanning the horizon for movement. The compact Homo floresiensis, moving silently through dense island forests, gathering fruit or setting primitive traps. The broad-shouldered Neanderthal, wrapped in animal hides, hauling the carcass of a mammoth through snow. They were all human in spirit, problem solvers, survivors, thinkers, yet their very bones told stories written in adaptation. When scientists study these fossils today, they often find that differences in height and proportion correlate directly with climate and geography. It's not random. Over time, the human body became a kind of biological thermometer, adjusting its size and shape to fit the temperature of its surroundings. Cold climates compressed bodies, reducing heat loss. Warm climates stretch them out, allowing heat to dissipate. This pattern continues subtly, even today, among global populations. But the most intriguing part of this story is how recent some of these size differences are. Homo floresiensis lived as recently as 50,000 years ago, meaning that when our own ancestors were painting caves in Europe and crafting tools in Africa, a tiny human species was thriving on an island in Indonesia. Think about that. While modern humans were spreading across continents, they shared their world with small cousins no taller than a child, yet capable of tool making and fire use. We were never alone in our evolutionary journey. We were part of a family of forms, a chorus of bodies and brains, experimenting with what it meant to be human. And just as some species shrank, others grew. Fossils from Kenya and Georgia show early humans reaching over 6 feet in height, tall even by modern standards. These towering individuals likely had access to abundant food, protein-rich diets, and favorable climates. Their height symbolized abundance, just as the islanders' small stature symbolized scarcity. Evolution, in essence, reflects the story of feast and famine, written in bone and height. When Homo sapiens finally spread across the globe, they carried within their genes the blueprint of this diversity. Some populations favored tallness for hunting and visibility. Others leaned toward compactness for endurance and energy conservation. What we see today in human height variation is a living echo of that ancient experiment, a mosaic of survival strategies that worked. So, when you think of ancient humans, don't picture a single archetype, a single form, marching uniformly through time. Instead, picture a world alive with diversity. Tall, lean figures under the African sun, short, clever beings navigating jungle shadows, broad, strong survivors trudging through snow. Each body was a solution, a story, a response to a question that nature asked again and again. What will survive here? That question defined the age of giants and dwarfs, an age not of competition, but of coexistence. Different shapes, different sizes, all bound by one unchanging instinct to live. And in that diversity lies the key to our species' resilience. We are, after all, the descendants of both the tall and the small. Every one of us carries the legacy of adaptation that began millions of years ago, when height was not a matter of vanity, but a matter of life itself. If there's one force that has quietly, relentlessly shaped the human form, one artist that's been sculpting our species since its first breath, it is climate. Not the immediate kind we think of when we say it's too hot or too cold outside, but the deep, ancient climate, the kind that shifts continents, that changes oceans, that rewrites the rules of survival. Over millions of years, this invisible hand has molded us, carved our proportions, and whispered into the architecture of our bones. Adapt or vanish. To understand how climate shaped human height, we must step back and think in terms of energy, temperature, and balance. Every living body is a machine that must maintain its internal temperature, regardless of what happens around it. Too much heat, and the body overheats. Too little, and it freezes. For most animals, this delicate equilibrium determines everything from size to shape. And humans, despite our intelligence, tools, and technology, were never exceptions to that rule. Before we had clothes, before we had fire, climate dictated the shape of our ancestors. In warm, tropical regions, where early humans likely evolved, the body's greatest challenge was cooling down. The African savannas, where Homo erectus and later Homo sapiens thrived, were brutally hot, dry, and open. To survive there, the human body needed to release heat efficiently. Tall, slender bodies provided the perfect solution. Long limbs increase surface area relative to volume, allowing heat to escape faster. A lean frame with less insulation makes it easier for air to flow over the skin. This is why the earliest Homo sapiens fossils found in Africa, like those at Omokibish and Herto, show tall, narrow skeletons. Their very structure was climate's answer to the question, how do you keep cool under the equatorial sun? Now, travel north, thousands of miles, and many millennia later, to Ice Age Europe, where a different human story unfolds. Here, the world was locked in ice, and the sun hung low in the sky. In this realm, the challenge was the opposite, not losing heat, but conserving it. The Neanderthals, those thick-boned, broad-bodied humans who dominated Europe for hundreds of thousands of years, were masterpieces of cold weather adaptation. Their shorter limbs, stocky frames, and barrel chests minimized heat loss. They were living furnaces, built to trap warmth and survive where the air itself seemed to bite. These patterns are so consistent across animal species that scientists have given them names: Bergmann's rule and Allen's rule. Bergmann's rule states that animals in colder regions tend to have larger, bulkier bodies, reducing heat loss, while those in warmer climates are smaller and leaner. Allen's rule adds that creatures in hot environments develop longer limbs, while those in cold areas evolve shorter ones. Together, these principles explain much of the variation in human height and body proportion across prehistory and even today. Look around the modern world, and these ancient rules still whisper in our DNA. Populations in equatorial Africa, such as the Dinka or Maasai of South Sudan, are famously tall and slender, a living echo of ancestral adaptation to heat. Meanwhile, groups from historically colder regions, the Inuit of the Arctic or the Sami of Northern Europe, tend to be shorter and more compact. These are not random traits. They are living fossils of climate's influence. But how exactly does climate translate into change? It's not magic. It's selection over generations. Bodies that fit their environment best survive more successfully and pass on their traits. In a hot region, tall, lean individuals could move, hunt, and cool down more efficiently. In a cold region, shorter, thicker individuals conserved energy and endured better. Over time, these advantages compound and the population's average body shape shifts, not consciously, not intentionally, but inevitably. Yet climate did more than sculpt bones. It shaped the rhythm of life itself. During periods of global warming, when the Earth's temperatures rose and vegetation spread, food became more abundant. Populations grew taller, nourished by steady diets and open landscapes. But during ice ages, when glaciers advanced and resources dwindled, height often declined. Malnutrition, scarcity, and physical stress limited growth, leaving literal records in skeletons. The climate's signature could be read in the stature of entire generations. Consider the dramatic transitions between warm and cold epochs over the past 2 million years. The Pleistocene, often called the Ice Age, wasn't a single unbroken freeze, but a series of advances and retreats, like the Earth breathing in and out. Each swing of the climate pendulum forced humanity to adapt anew. In the warm interglacial periods, humans spread, grew, and flourished. In the cold glacial stretches, they huddled, shrank, and survived. The climate didn't just influence height, it dictated who lived long enough to reproduce. Even within a single species, climate's fingerprints are visible. Early Homo sapiens who migrated from Africa into Europe and Asia had to adapt rapidly. In warmer regions like South Asia and the Pacific, taller, leaner forms persisted. In colder northern territories, compact bodies emerged. It was not evolution in the distant sense. It was evolution in real time, visible within a few hundred generations. Nature sculpted as swiftly as the ice advanced. There's another layer to this story, one less visible, but equally powerful: the relationship between height, energy, and survival in climate extremes. The human body requires fuel to regulate temperature. Larger, taller individuals burn more calories simply to function. In hot climates, with abundant vegetation and game, this wasn't a problem. But in cold, barren tundras, where food was scarce, large bodies demanded too much energy to sustain. Smaller frames, requiring less fuel, had a survival edge. Climate dictated the menu, and the menu dictated the body. And then there's altitude, a microclimate that added yet another dimension to human diversity. High altitude populations, like those in the Andes or the Himalayas, developed shorter, barrel like chests to increase lung capacity and oxygen efficiency. Again, body form reflected not preference, but adaptation. The invisible sculptor never stopped working. Modern science can even trace this relationship at the genetic level. Certain alleles that influence height and metabolism show geographic clustering, patterns that mirror ancient climate zones. The genes we inherit for height are not just random code, they are evolutionary echoes of where our ancestors lived and how their bodies learned to survive there. But climate's artistry wasn't static. It changed constantly, sometimes violently. When the last ice age ended, around 12,000 years ago, temperatures rose sharply, forests spread, seas rose, and humanity entered the Holocene, the relatively warm, stable period we still live in today. This climatic shift not only changed where people could live, but also what they could eat. New diets, grains, domesticated animals, and cultivated plants began to interact with old genetic frameworks. The result? A dramatic reshaping of human height. Once again, climate had laid the foundation. Civilization would now begin the remodeling. It's fascinating to think that the height of modern populations still dances to the tune of ancient temperature changes. Even now, the tallest nations, the Dutch, the Montenegrins, the Dinka, trace their lineage to regions where nutrition and moderate climates aligned perfectly. In contrast, populations whose ancestors endured harsher or more isolated conditions still bear subtler, shorter statures, not as a flaw, but as the quiet proof of adaptation's genius. Climate has always been the silent conversation partner of humanity. It doesn't speak in words, it speaks in bodies. Every time a glacier advanced, it whispered for compactness. Every time the sun scorched the plains, it whispered for length. Over millions of years, those whispers became form: arms, legs, torsos, and the intricate geometry of bone that defines who we are. And perhaps most astonishing of all is that this sculpting never truly ended. As our modern climate warms once again, as global temperatures shift and environments change, the invisible artist continues to shape us, subtly, quietly, through the generations. The process is slower now, cushioned by technology, clothing, and shelter, but the dialogue between climate and biology persists beneath it all. In the grand story of human height, climate wasn't just a background setting, it was the director, the architect, the unseen hand that drew the first lines of our design. Without its heat, cold, and chaos, humanity might have remained one uniform shape, but instead, climate carved diversity into our very bones, ensuring that wherever humans went, they could survive, adapt, and endure. The invisible sculptor never signed its work. It didn't need to. Its signature is everywhere, in the tall, graceful silhouettes of those who trace their heritage to warm lands, and in the strong, compact frames of those who descend from icy frontiers. Every human body, in its proportions and its presence, is a living statue, carved by the elements, shaped by survival, perfected by time. Imagine standing face to face with a Neanderthal, not as a museum exhibit or a reconstruction behind glass, but as a living, breathing being, eyes reflecting firelight, hands thick and powerful, a presence both familiar and foreign. You'd recognize them as human, yet everything about them would feel heavier. Their bodies radiated strength, their chests were deep, their arms muscular, their faces framed by pronounced brow ridges. They weren't the stooped, cave dwellers early scientists once imagined. They were robust, intelligent, and astonishingly adapted to the unforgiving chill of Ice Age Europe. Now imagine turning your gaze toward one of their contemporaries, an early Homo sapiens, a modern human ancestor. This individual stands taller, leaner, built with long limbs and narrower hips. Their face is smaller, smoother, their bones more delicate. They move with a quiet, deliberate grace. The difference between them and the Neanderthal is not just size, it is design. Both were masterpieces of adaptation, sculpted by different climates and lifestyles, living side by side for tens of thousands of years. And in the story of human height and form, their contrast offers one of the clearest windows into how environment and evolution work hand in hand. Let's start with the Neanderthals. They emerged roughly 400,000 years ago, descended from an ancestor called Homo heidelbergensis, who had already adapted to cooler climates. Europe at the time was a harsh, fluctuating world. Glacial periods alternated with short warm spells, forests thinned, and herds of mammoths, woolly rhinoceroses, and reindeer roamed the tundra. To survive here, a body needed to conserve every ounce of heat. So, nature began to shorten and strengthen them. Their average height was around 5 feet 5 inches for males and 5 feet for females, shorter than the modern human average. But what they lacked in stature, they made up for in density. Neanderthal bones were thicker, heavier, and carried more muscle attachments than ours. Their rib cages were wide and deep, giving them massive lung capacity, an internal furnace for the cold. Their pelvises flared outward, supporting powerful legs. Their hands were broad and strong, fingers built for gripping spears, scraping hides, and manipulating tools. Even their skulls were adapted, larger, with a pronounced mid-face that helped warm and humidify frigid air before it reached their lungs. Everything about a Neanderthal's body whispered endurance. They burned enormous amounts of calories to sustain their bulk, relying on a protein-heavy diet of meat from large animals. To hunt effectively, they needed brute strength more than speed, and their builds reflected that. Short limbs reduced heat loss and gave them stability in rough terrain. Their compact proportions were the living embodiment of Bergman's and Allen's rules, those evolutionary principles linking climate and body size. In the frozen valleys and wind-lashed plateaus of Ice Age Europe, this form wasn't just efficient, it was survival incarnate. Now contrast that with early Homo sapiens, who evolved in Africa under entirely different conditions. There, the sun blazed, the land opened wide, and endurance running became one of our defining strengths. In such an environment, long limbs and a slender frame weren't just advantageous, they were essential. Heat needed to escape, not be trapped. A tall, lean body allowed better cooling through sweat and blood flow near the skin's surface. Every evolutionary detail of Homo sapiens design, from limb ratio to body fat distribution, echoed a world of warmth. When modern humans began migrating out of Africa around 60,000 years ago, they carried these tropical proportions with them. As they moved into cooler regions, like Europe and Asia, they encountered the Neanderthals, who had been refining their cold climate physiques for hundreds of millennia. Imagine those first encounters, two intelligent species, sharing tools, landscapes, and perhaps even campfires, yet so different in form, one built for endurance and agility, the other for strength and insulation. Evolution had written two variations of the same human theme. It's fascinating that despite their physical differences, both species thrived in overlapping territories for thousands of years. They hunted similar prey, built shelters, and even cared for their sick and elderly. But their contrasting physiques gave them different advantages. A Neanderthal could outlift and outmuscle any modern human of their time. Their grip strength alone could crush bones. Yet, early Homo sapiens could travel longer distances, conserve energy more efficiently, and adapt more quickly to changing climates. The taller, leaner build of modern humans made them masters of mobility. Scientists studying Neanderthal skeletons often describe their bodies as optimized for power at close range. They were sprinters, ambushers, their muscle mass far exceeding ours. But that muscle came with a cost: high caloric demand and limited endurance. Homo sapiens, by contrast, were optimized for pursuit. They could chase wounded prey across miles of savanna, relying on sweat cooling and stamina rather than brute force. The very difference in height and proportion reflected two contrasting survival philosophies, one rooted in resilience, the other in persistence. Interestingly, the two species weren't entirely isolated. Genetic studies show that modern humans carry between 1 and 3% Neanderthal DNA, proof of ancient interbreeding. These encounters weren't just social or sexual, they were genetic exchanges between two physical worlds. Some of those Neanderthal genes still influence our bodies today, affecting skin tone, immune response, and even how fat is distributed. Small remnants of Ice Age adaptation hidden within our modern genomes. But why, then, did one species vanish while the other survived? Many theories exist: climate shifts, population size, adaptability, or simple chance. Yet one thing stands out: Homo sapiens were more versatile. Their taller, lighter frames, coupled with more complex social structures and wider diets, allowed them to endure environmental changes that the stockier Neanderthals could not. When forests receded and the ice retreated, the traits that once favored Neanderthals, strength, compactness, dependence on a large game, became less useful. The same cold that had forged them eventually became their undoing. What's remarkable, though, is how modern humans began to evolve physically after encountering and outlasting Neanderthals. As they spread northward through colder climates, their own bodies began to subtly shift. Populations living in Europe and northern Asia became shorter and broader compared to their African ancestors, a gradual echo of Neanderthal-like adaptation. Evolution was still sculpting us, still applying its timeless rule. The environment decides the shape of survival. If you compare an average human from equatorial Africa with one from northern Europe today, you're still seeing this ancient contrast. The tall, long-limbed build of the African plains speaks of heat and open horizons. The shorter, more compact build of northern populations whispers of cold winds and winter scarcity. In both cases, height and proportion are not accidents. They are the living reflections of climate and ancestry. Even the way we perceive height may trace back to these prehistoric differences. Taller stature often evokes impressions of agility, reach, and confidence, traits once vital for spotting predators or leading migrations. Stockier builds, conversely, signal strength and stability, traits that meant survival in icy caves and rugged terrains. These instincts, once practical, still linger subconsciously in modern human behavior and perception. The story of Neanderthals and modern humans isn't one of superiority or inferiority. It's one of context. Each form was perfect for its world. The Neanderthal's dense, muscular frame was a triumph of Ice Age engineering. The modern human's taller, lighter body was a triumph of adaptability. Together, they represent two evolutionary strategies, both successful, both brilliant, separated not by intelligence, but by circumstance. And in the end, their differences weren't barriers, but bridges. The merging of their genes ensured that both lineages live on in us. Every human alive today carries the faint memory of both. the strength of the Neanderthal, and the agility of Homo sapiens. Our proportions, our heights, even the way we stand and move, are echoes of those ancient forms. So when we speak of height, of tallness and shortness, of proportion and variation, we are really speaking of that ancient conversation between two species that once shared the earth. The Neanderthals remind us of what it meant to stand firm against the cold. The early modern humans remind us of what it meant to move toward new horizons. Between them lies the blueprint of all humanity, the enduring balance between strength and grace, endurance and adaptation, the compact and the tall. Their story isn't a battle between species, it's a portrait of possibility, proof that there is no single, ideal human form, only the one that fits its time and place. And as climates shift again, and our world changes once more, the same forces that sculpted them still move quietly beneath the surface, shaping the next chapter of what we will become. If you could look into the kitchen of evolution, the place where human height and strength were quietly cooked over thousands of years, you'd find that the main ingredient was not genetics alone. It was diet, what humans ate, when they ate, and how they got their food shaped their bodies as much as climate or geography ever did. From the wild forager chasing gazelles to the early farmer tending fields of grain, every shift in menu reshaped the human frame, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. Let's step back in time, around 100,000 years ago, long before farming, before domestication, before civilization. Picture the life of a forager. They moved constantly, tracking herds across plains, collecting roots, berries, nuts, and honey. Food was diverse, unpredictable, and hard-earned, but it was also nutritionally rich. Wild plants contained dense vitamins and minerals. Wild meat offered lean, powerful protein, and natural fats from nuts and animals fueled endurance. In that era, the human diet was a symphony of variety, and that variety fed evolution's masterpiece: tall, strong, active bodies. The forager's life demanded energy and muscle. A day's work wasn't sitting at a desk or plowing a field. It was walking 10 miles, running 2, climbing, digging, carrying. Every calorie had to count. Because of that, natural selection favored those whose metabolisms and physiques could thrive on intermittent meals and bursts of physical labor. The result? For tens of thousands of years, early humans were generally taller and more robust than many of their descendants would later become. Fossil records from the Upper Paleolithic, roughly 40,000 to 10,000 years ago, show that average male height often reached 5 feet 10 inches or more, while women averaged around 5 feet 6. Those numbers are impressive even by modern standards. But then something happened, something that would change human biology forever. Around 12,000 years ago, a quiet revolution began in several corners of the world. In the Fertile Crescent, humans started planting wheat and barley. In China, rice. In the Americas, maize. Slowly, the hunter became the harvester, and the gatherer became the grower. Humanity's greatest transformation, the agricultural revolution, had begun. At first glance, it must have seemed like a miracle. No more chasing prey across endless plains. No more relying on the fickle rhythms of migration or fruiting seasons. Food could be grown, stored, and shared. Villages appeared, then towns. Populations exploded. But beneath this golden story of progress lay a biological price. When humans traded the freedom of foraging for the predictability of farming, their bodies began to change, and not always for the better. Early farmers, we now know from skeletal evidence, were shorter and less robust than their forager ancestors. In some regions, average height dropped by as much as 6 inches within a few thousand years. Their bones became thinner, their joints showed signs of strain, and their teeth, once strong and even, began to decay. Why? Because agriculture narrowed the human diet dramatically. Where foragers ate hundreds of plant species and dozens of animal types, farmers often relied on a few staple crops: wheat, rice, maize, millet. These grains were rich in carbohydrates, but poor in key nutrients like protein, calcium, and iron. Suddenly, the human diet became repetitive, and with repetition came deficiency. Iron deficiency anemia became common, especially among women. Enamel hypoplasia, the weakening of teeth caused by poor nutrition during childhood, began appearing in skeletons across early farming sites. Growth stunted, immune systems weakened. In essence, humanity had swapped abundance for security, and the body showed it. But the story isn't one of pure decline. As farming spread and societies evolved, humans began to adapt. Over generations, some populations developed genetic responses to their new diets. The ability to digest lactose, for example, milk sugar, evolved in pastoralist cultures where dairy became a staple. This mutation allowed adults to continue drinking milk throughout life, providing a vital source of protein and calcium. Those who carried it had an advantage in survival and reproduction. It's a reminder that evolution never stops. It simply shifts its focus to the challenges of the present. Farming also allowed communities to specialize. Not everyone had to hunt or gather. Some could become tool makers, builders, artists, thinkers. And while average height may have decreased initially, overall survival increased. More children could be fed, even if less perfectly nourished. Civilization, for all its flaws, was the child of agriculture, and with it came new patterns of diet and health that continue to shape our heights today. Interestingly, height became a kind of biological record of societal prosperity. When food was abundant and diverse, people grew taller. When famine struck or diets narrowed, they shrank. Historical records across Europe and Asia show these fluctuations clearly. During the early medieval period, for example, average male height in Europe hovered around 5 feet 7 inches, but as urbanization, disease, and poor sanitation spread, that number fell during the Industrial Revolution, only to rise again in the 20th century as nutrition improved. Height, in this sense, became a mirror of social evolution, a reflection not of genetic potential, but of how well societies fed their people. But diet didn't just affect stature, it shaped how human bodies functioned. High protein, high fat forager diets produced strong bones and lean muscle, ideal for mobility and endurance. Grain based diets, rich in carbohydrates but lacking amino acids, favored energy storage and fat retention, traits that were beneficial in times of scarcity but problematic in abundance. Over centuries, these shifts influenced metabolism itself. The modern human tendency to store fat efficiently to crave sugars and starches is an echo of that ancient agricultural compromise. Survival in feast and famine cycles that no longer exist for most of us today. There's another layer to this story: social inequality. In many ancient agricultural societies, not everyone ate the same way. The wealthy had access to meat, fish, and imported delicacies, while the poor subsisted on basic grains. Archaeological evidence from Egyptian tombs, for example, shows that nobles were generally taller and healthier than commoners buried nearby. Height, once purely environmental, became a social marker, an indicator of privilege and access, and that pattern, in many ways, persists. Even today, average height often correlates with economic prosperity, access to health care, and quality of nutrition. The journey from forager to farmer also brought profound cultural changes that indirectly shaped height. Farming required permanence, settled communities, predictable seasons, and shared labor. This stability allowed for population growth, but also increased exposure to disease. When people lived closely together, pathogens spread faster. Malnutrition, combined with infection, became a potent brake on growth, especially in children. It wasn't until sanitation, medicine, and diet diversity returned in the modern era that average human height began to recover fully. Today, scientists studying prehistoric skeletons can often tell at a glance whether someone was a forager or a farmer. The difference is written in bone density, tooth wear, and stature. Foragers' remains speak of strength and height, while farmers' bones tell a story of endurance and adaptation. Both ways of life were ingenious in their own right, one mastering movement, the other mastering control, and together they show that the human body is a reflection of what it eats, not just where it lives. If we think about it, our own modern diets are just another chapter in that story. The global availability of protein, fresh produce, and vitamins has helped average human height rise dramatically in the past century. But processed foods, refined sugars, and sedentary lifestyles are new challenges evolution hasn't yet caught up to. We are, in many ways, a mix of forager biology and farmer habits, built for a past that no longer exists, living in a world we've made too comfortable. The evolution of height through diet is a tale of trade-offs. Diversity bred strength, simplicity bred survival. Together, they formed the backbone of humanity's growth and its limits. Our ancestors didn't choose to be taller or shorter. They simply ate what their world offered. And in those choices, in the wild roots, the roasted meats, the fields of wheat, the blueprint of the modern human body was written. So the next time you sit down for a meal, consider this. Every bite you take carries echoes of that long journey, from the forests of our foraging past to the fertile plains of agriculture. In every grain of rice, every piece of fruit, every sip of milk, lies the story of how food shaped us, how it built the tall and the small, the strong and the subtle. In the end, we are all, quite literally, what we eat. If diet and climate are the hands that shape the human body, then genetics is the blueprint, the invisible framework underlying every inch of our stature. It's the instruction manual, written in DNA, passed down through countless generations, quietly directing growth from conception to adulthood. To understand why some humans are tall and others short, we have to look deep into this blueprint, not just at individual genes, but at the symphony of interactions that determines the height of every human being. Human height is one of the most obvious traits we inherit, but it's far from simple. Unlike a single gene trait, like eye color or certain blood types, height is polygenic, meaning it's influenced by hundreds, sometimes thousands, of different genes. Each gene contributes a small effect, nudging growth upward or downward. Some genes influence the length of long bones, others affect growth hormones, and still others regulate how cells divide and differentiate. Think of it like a vast orchestra, where each instrument plays a tiny part, yet together they create a majestic symphony. The human form, among the most important genetic players, are the genes that regulate growth hormone and its receptor, such as GH1 and GHR. Growth hormone, as the name suggests, drives cell proliferation and bone elongation during childhood and adolescence. Mutations in these genes can lead to dramatic height differences, from conditions like gigantism, where excessive hormone leads to extraordinary height, to dwarfism, where insufficient hormone or receptor activity limits growth. But these are extreme cases. For the average person, dozens of minor variations in these and other genes combine to determine whether someone is tall, average, or short. It's not just hormones. Genes like HMGA2, discovered through genome-wide association studies, have subtle but measurable effects on height, influencing bone growth patterns. Others, like SNPs scattered across the genome, modulate how efficiently the body metabolizes nutrients, responds to stresses, or produces structural proteins like collagen, all indirectly shaping skeletal development. Height is therefore a product not just of growth signals, but of the entire biological environment in which those signals operate. What makes human height genetics fascinating is how it interacts with ancestry and evolution. Certain alleles, variants of a gene, are more common in populations from specific regions. For example, populations from the Netherlands, known for their tall stature, carry a higher frequency of height-promoting alleles. Conversely, populations adapted to harsh northern climates, such as the Inuit, have more alleles favoring compact builds. These differences reflect tens of thousands of years of natural selection, a genetic dialogue between humans and their environments. But genes don't act in isolation. Height is also highly sensitive to epigenetics, changes in gene expression influenced by environmental factors such as nutrition, stress, or disease exposure. For example, children who experience malnutrition during early development may never reach their full genetic potential for height, even if they carry tall alleles. Conversely, abundant nutrition can unlock growth potential, allowing those same genes to express themselves fully. In this way, height is a living record of both ancestry and life experience. We can also see genetics influence through the lens of evolution. Early humans in different regions evolved distinct body proportions, often in response to climate, diet, and lifestyle. These adaptations were encoded in DNA and passed through generations. For instance, the long-limbed, tall body type favored in equatorial Africa likely became prevalent because those genes enhanced heat dissipation and mobility, providing a survival advantage. In contrast, compact, shorter builds in Ice Age Europe reflected selection for heat retention. Modern genetic studies confirm these patterns, revealing that much of the variation in height among populations can be traced to evolutionary pressures acting on specific alleles over millennia. Genetic studies have also shed light on the interplay between height and disease. Certain height-associated genes are linked to risks for metabolic conditions, cardiovascular disease, or bone density problems. This suggests that evolution optimized height not purely for stature, but as part of a broader survival strategy. Taller stature often confers advantages in reproduction or social signaling, but it also comes with metabolic costs, creating a delicate evolutionary balance. Nature doesn't aim for maximum height, it aims for fit for survival height, the kind that maximizes reproductive success while minimizing risk. Interestingly, recent advances in genetic research reveal that height is influenced not only by inherited DNA from parents, but also by the genetic material carried from ancient human species. Studies show that modern humans carry small amounts of Neanderthal DNA, and some of these fragments influence traits related to growth and metabolism. While the effects are subtle, they remind us that our genetics are a mosaic of ancestral contributions, not just from Homo sapiens, but from the diverse species that once shared our world. Even today, your height may bear traces of this deep history. Modern science can now predict a person's adult height with surprising accuracy by analyzing hundreds of genetic markers. Large-scale genome-wide association studies have identified over 3,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms, tiny variations in DNA that together explain around 40–50% of height variation. The remaining variation comes from environmental factors like diet, disease, and early childhood conditions. This dual influence of genes and environment illustrates perfectly why height is both a personal and historical story, written in our DNA and shaped by the world we grow up in. What makes height genetics even more fascinating is its interaction with social behavior. Across cultures, taller individuals have historically been favored in mate selection, leadership, and social status, subtly reinforcing certain alleles over generations. This is not just human vanity. Evolutionary psychology suggests that height signaled strength, health, and the ability to survive. Over thousands of years, these social pressures may have nudged populations toward taller averages in some regions, while allowing shorter stature in others. And yet, despite the complexity, the process is beautifully efficient. From the tiniest molecular change in a growth gene to the massive anatomical differences it produces, the human body orchestrates growth as if guided by an invisible conductor. Every bone elongates at the right time, every growth plate responds to hormones, and every system interacts seamlessly, all orchestrated by the quiet, precise language of DNA. So when we ask why humans are tall or short, the answer is never simple. Height is a conversation, a dialogue between genes, environment, climate, nutrition, and even culture. It is the product of millions of years of evolution, written in the microscopic letters of DNA and expressed in the very bones that carry us through life. Each person's stature is a living record of ancestry, adaptation, and survival, a tangible link to the prehistoric world. In essence, Genetics is the blueprint that sets the stage, but it is environment, lifestyle, and history that bring it to life. Without the blueprint, there would be no form. Without the conditions to realize it, the blueprint would remain latent, a potential never realized. Together, they produce the astonishing diversity of human height: the tall, the short, the medium, and everything in between. And through this complex interplay, we continue the story of humanity, one generation, one body, 1 inch at a time. Height, as we've seen, is a remarkable interplay between genetics, climate, and diet. But there's another, often invisible force shaping human stature: disease and the pressures of survival. Long before medicine, sanitation, or even understanding germs, humans faced a world teeming with pathogens, parasites, and environmental hazards. Every infection, every malnutrition episode, and every period of scarcity left its mark, not just on individual bodies, but on the height of entire populations over generations. To understand this, consider the biology of growth. Childhood and adolescence are the periods when bones lengthen most rapidly, when growth plates are active, and when nutrition and health have the greatest influence. Exposure to disease during these critical windows can dramatically affect development. Even mild, chronic infections can reduce appetite, divert energy from growth to immune response, and interfere with nutrient absorption. The result? Stunted growth, shorter adult height, and a skeletal record of hardship etched in bone. Throughout prehistory, survival was a constant struggle. The hunter-gatherer lifestyle, while rich in nutrition, still exposed humans to countless pathogens: bacteria from untreated water, parasites from uncooked food, and injuries that could easily become infected. Populations living in dense groups faced even greater risks. Once humans settled into farming communities, these pressures increased. Living close to livestock and stored grains brought new bacteria and viruses into daily life. Waste accumulated in villages, and epidemics spread faster than ever before. Height, in this sense, became a mirror of disease exposure. Fossil and skeletal evidence from early agricultural societies clearly shows the effects of this survival pressure. For example, studies of skeletons from Neolithic Europe reveal that early farmers were often several inches shorter than their forager ancestors. Signs of iron deficiency anemia, rickets, and dental enamel hypoplasia are common. These are direct markers of nutritional stress combined with disease exposure, a silent record of the challenges these communities faced. In some cases, it wasn't merely individual malnutrition. Entire populations were affected, creating measurable shifts in average height over generations. Infectious disease didn't only stunt growth, it also acted as a form of natural selection. Populations exposed to harsh environments and high pathogen loads often saw mortality concentrated in the very young or the very weak. Those who survived were often more robust, with bodies capable of fighting off infections more efficiently. In this sense, survival pressure was a sculptor, not creating taller or shorter humans intentionally, but shaping populations in subtle ways. Where disease was rampant, smaller or more energy-efficient bodies sometimes had an advantage, requiring fewer calories to survive periods of illness and scarcity. The influence of disease on height is also closely tied to social and environmental factors. Communities with greater access to clean water, better food variety, or protective shelter often produced taller individuals, even when genetics were similar. Conversely, populations under constant nutritional stress, parasitic infection, or frequent epidemics tended to be shorter. Over time, these pressures accumulate, leaving a deep imprint on the human skeleton, a biological history of survival. Consider children growing up in prehistoric societies. A young child facing repeated bouts of diarrhea from contaminated water or infections from a wound would expend energy on healing rather than growth. Their diet, even if adequate in calories, might not supply the nutrients needed to repair tissue or support bone elongation. Each illness leaves subtle skeletal markers, enamel defects in teeth, changes in bone density, or shortened long bones. Multiply this by an entire generation, and you see population level differences in height emerge, the result of survival challenges rather than genetic limitations alone. Diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, and parasitic infestations further illustrate this point. Tuberculosis, which has plagued humans for thousands of years, can cause wasting and limit growth if contracted during childhood. Malaria, by triggering chronic anemia, similarly diverts resources away from skeletal development. Parasitic worms, common in prehistoric and early farming societies, reduce nutrient absorption, leading to stunted growth. Each of these pressures, acting in combination with climate, diet, and genetics, leaves a distinct mark on human stature. Even in modern times, the connection between disease, nutrition, and height remains clear. Epidemiological studies show that populations with high childhood disease burdens tend to have lower average heights. Conversely, access to vaccines, clean water, and balanced nutrition allows populations to approach their full genetic height potential. In this sense, the human skeleton is a historical ledger, recording not just genetic inheritance, but the cumulative burden of survival challenges across time. Beyond disease, survival pressure also includes predation and physical labor. Early humans faced predators, environmental hazards, and physically demanding daily routines. Energy had to be allocated efficiently. Taller bodies require more calories and are more vulnerable to injury or exhaustion. In environments where survival demanded constant activity, selection sometimes favored slightly smaller, more energy efficient bodies, not as a limitation, but as an advantage. Height, in this context, is a balancing act. Too tall, and the body risks exhaustion or malnutrition. Too short, and visibility, hunting ability, or social dominance may be compromised. Evolution's silent hand weighed all these pressures over millennia. Interestingly, survival pressure also interacts with social structures. In early human communities, social cooperation often mitigated environmental stresses. Those with access to shared food or protection from the group had a better chance of reaching their genetic height potential. Communities with greater inequality, or individuals with less access to resources, might be shorter on average. Height, therefore, is not just biological, it is a reflection of social and environmental history. In prehistoric populations, skeletal evidence shows that men and women were affected differently. Women often grew shorter due to the combined stresses of nutrition, disease, and reproductive energy demands. Pregnancy and lactation require enormous caloric investment, diverting resources away from skeletal growth if nutritional intake is insufficient. Men, while less directly affected by reproduction, were still shaped by environmental challenges, hunting, fighting, and enduring harsh climates. The resulting sexual dimorphism in height reflects both biology and the pressures of survival. Ultimately, the impact of disease and survival pressure on height is a story of resilience. It is a reminder that every human body carries the memory of struggle, not just genetic inheritance, but the lived realities of ancestors facing illness, scarcity, and danger. The tall, the average, the short, each is a record of adaptation, endurance, and survival under conditions that would challenge even modern humans. When we look at height today, it is tempting to see it as a purely personal trait, a matter of nutrition, exercise, or genetics. But in truth, it is the outcome of millions of years of evolutionary negotiation. It tells us about ancient climates, diets, and pathogens. It tells us about the survival pressures our ancestors faced and the compromises their bodies made to endure. Height is, in essence, a living testament to human resilience, a measure not only of bone, but of history, environment, and the relentless push to survive. And so, the next time you consider why humans are taller or shorter, remember this: behind every inch of height lies a story of adaptation and survival. Each human form is the product of countless generations, navigating disease, scarcity, and environmental pressures. Height is not just a number, it is the embodiment of survival itself. Human history is, at its core, a story of movement. Our species has never stayed in one place for long. We've crossed deserts, climbed mountains, forded rivers, and sailed oceans. This relentless migration, driven by climate, resources, conflict, or curiosity, has left indelible marks on our bodies, particularly on height. Movement forces adaptation, and adaptation over millennia subtly sculpts our bones, muscles, and stature. To understand why humans are taller or shorter, we must follow the journey of migration and the transformations it demanded. When early Homo sapiens began leaving Africa roughly 60,000 years ago, they encountered environments unlike anything they had ever known. From the hot savannas to the frigid tundra, from coastal plains to high-altitude plateaus, these migrations were not merely journeys of distance, they were journeys of survival. Each new landscape brought novel challenges: extreme cold, limited food, new predators, unfamiliar diseases. Height and body proportions became tools for adaptation, subtly shifting with every generation to match the demands of new territories. Consider the first humans moving into Europe. They were tall, long-limbed, and adapted to warm African climates. Yet as they faced ice age temperatures, natural selection favored bodies that could retain heat more efficiently. Over generations, populations in Northern Europe and Asia became slightly shorter and broader, a pattern consistent with Bergman's and Allen's rules. Compact bodies conserve warmth and minimize energy expenditure in cold climates, while taller, leaner bodies allow heat to dissipate in warmer regions. Migration exposed humans to diverse climates, and height, alongside limb proportions, evolved as a direct response. Migration also interacted with dietary availability. Populations moving into regions with scarce animal protein or staple crops often grew shorter, not because of genetic limitations, but because nutrition constrained growth. Conversely, migration into fertile regions with abundant food sometimes encouraged taller stature. A child growing in a new environment might inherit genes for height, but if local food resources were insufficient, their body could not reach full genetic potential. Migration created a dance between genetics and environment where height reflected the dynamic balance between inherited potential and local opportunity. But movement did more than change average stature. It created regional diversity within species. As human groups spread and became partially isolated, distinct populations evolved specific adaptations to their environments. Island populations, for example, often exhibited dwarfism, as seen with Homo floresiensis, because limited resources favored smaller bodies. Mountain populations evolved shorter, stockier builds to maximize oxygen efficiency and conserve energy. These differences in body size and proportion were not just curiosities, they were essential survival strategies dictated by the specific challenges of each new habitat. High altitude migration provides a particularly striking example. Populations in the Andes, Himalayas, and Ethiopian highlands developed shorter stature with barrel-shaped torsos, a design that increases lung efficiency in low oxygen conditions. Individuals with taller, thinner bodies would struggle to transport enough oxygen to their tissues at these altitudes. Over generations, the population's average height adjusted, producing a form finely tuned to extreme environmental pressures. Migration, in this sense, directly dictated skeletal form, shaping the blueprint of human stature based on the air people breathed and the terrain they traversed. In addition to climate and diet, disease pressure during migration influenced height. As populations moved into new regions, they encountered pathogens to which they had no prior immunity. Children growing under repeated infection pressure often failed to reach full adult height, producing shorter generations. Populations that survived this pressure had genetic and physiological traits, allowing better disease resistance, indirectly influencing height over time. Every movement across continents left subtle marks on human form, written invisibly into bones. Migration also facilitated genetic mixing, which could increase variation in height. When separate populations interbred, offspring inherited a combination of genes for stature from multiple lineages. For instance, as modern humans spread across Europe, they likely interbred with Neanderthals. Some of the genetic material contributed to immunity, metabolism, and possibly growth patterns, influencing the stature of subsequent populations. Migration, therefore, did not just shape height through environmental pressures, it also introduced new genetic tools for adaptation, creating a complex mosaic of traits across the globe. Human history shows that migration was often cyclical. Populations would move in response to climate shifts, returning when conditions improved. Each migration event layered additional adaptations on the skeletal record. Archaeological studies reveal that skeletal remains from multiple periods in the same region can show measurable changes in average height. One generation taller, the next shorter, reflecting not just genetics, but the immediate pressures of survival, food availability, and climate. Height became a record of movement, both in physical space and evolutionary time. Even within continents, migration shaped diversity. In Africa, populations moving into desert regions became taller and leaner, traits promoting heat dissipation and mobility across long distances. Those moving into forested or highland areas evolved shorter, sturdier frames for energy efficiency and agility. In Asia, northern populations became compact and robust to conserve heat, while southern populations remained taller and more slender. Height was a living map of human movement, a physical biography of where people had been and what they endured. Migration's influence extends into the modern era as well. Urbanization, globalization, and international movement continue to affect height indirectly. Populations with access to diverse nutrition, improved healthcare, and less exposure to infectious disease tend to grow taller over generations, even as they mix genetically with other groups. The skeletal record of migration has transformed from millennia-long shifts to rapid changes over a few generations, but the principle remains. Movement exposes humans to new conditions, and our bodies respond. Finally, migration demonstrates that human height is not static. It is dynamic, responding to the combined forces of environment, diet, disease, and genetics. Each movement of people is an experiment in adaptation, a chance for new forms to emerge, and a test of survival strategies. Tall, short, compact, elongated, all forms are part of a vast spectrum sculpted by the journey of our species across the planet. Height is, in a sense, humanity's diary of travel etched in bone. When we look at modern populations today, we can still trace these patterns. Northern Europeans tend to be taller on average, reflecting generations in temperate climates with abundant food. Certain island or mountain populations are shorter and stockier, echoing the selective pressures of altitude or limited resources. Migration has left its fingerprints everywhere, not just on genes, but on the very shapes of our bodies. In sum, migration is more than movement. It is a driving force of adaptation, a sculptor of human form, and a key reason for the incredible diversity in height we see across the globe. Every step our ancestors took reshaped the blueprint of the human body. Height is the living proof of that journey, the subtle, intricate signature of millennia spent moving, surviving, and adapting to an ever-changing world. Height is more than biology. It is survival, yes, but it is also deeply social, intertwined with attraction, mating, and the subtle signals humans have exchanged for tens of thousands of years. From the earliest hunter-gatherer groups to modern urban societies, height has played a crucial role in sexual selection, the evolutionary process where certain traits increase the likelihood of reproductive success. Understanding how sexual selection influenced height helps explain why humans display such wide variation and why tallness, in particular, has held such enduring appeal. To begin, let's step back to prehistoric times. Early humans lived in small bands, often under constant threat from predators, rival groups, and harsh climates. Strength, agility, and endurance were essential survival traits. In this context, height became an honest signal. A taller individual, especially a male, generally possessed longer limbs, more muscle mass, and greater reach, all advantageous traits for hunting, defense, and social dominance. These advantages made taller males more attractive mates, not simply out of aesthetic preference, but because their offspring were more likely to survive in a dangerous world. Anthropologists suggest that this preference for taller males is universal across cultures, hinting at deep evolutionary roots. Even today, women often unconsciously prefer taller men, associating height with strength, protection, and health. It's important to note that sexual selection does not always prioritize the absolute tallest or strongest. Rather, it favors traits that reliably indicate fitness. Height, being strongly correlated with nutrition, immunity, and overall health, serves as a relatively honest signal. In the eyes of early humans, a taller male represented not just size, but vitality, the potential to contribute resources and ensure survival. For females, the pattern is more nuanced but equally significant. Taller females sometimes had advantages in foraging efficiency, childbirth, and social influence within the group. Across some populations, moderate height was often preferred, tall enough to be healthy and robust, but not so tall as to increase nutritional demands during times of scarcity. Sexual selection, in this way, shaped not only male height, but also female height, balancing survival needs with reproductive potential. Height also intersects with social dominance. In many early societies, taller individuals naturally assumed leadership roles. They could reach higher branches for fruit, see farther across plains, or intimidate rivals more effectively. Leadership, in turn, increased access to mates. Being tall conferred a social advantage that translated directly into reproductive success. Over generations, populations with these selective pressures slowly shifted toward taller averages, especially in regions where resources could support larger bodies. However, sexual selection is not uniform. Different environments and societies create different preferences, and these preferences influence height evolution differently. In resource-rich regions, where taller bodies could be sustained nutritionally, taller individuals were favored. In harsher climates, where energy conservation was critical, extreme height could be disadvantageous. Here, moderate stature, compact builds, or proportional strength could outweigh sheer tallness in sexual selection. Evolution, in this sense, is a negotiation between environmental demands and reproductive advantage. Cultural practices also magnified the effects of sexual selection as human societies became more complex. Status, wealth, and power began to influence mate choice. Taller individuals often enjoyed greater social visibility and prestige, which further reinforced height as an attractive trait. In certain societies, height became intertwined with ritual, hierarchy, and symbolism, signaling not just physical ability, but social and reproductive fitness. The taller you were, the more likely you were to be noticed, respected, and ultimately to reproduce. Another layer of evolutionary feedback. Interestingly, sexual selection interacts with genetics and growth. Taller individuals, being more likely to reproduce successfully, pass on height-promoting genes to the next generation. This doesn't mean that everyone becomes tall over time. Environmental factors like nutrition, disease, and climate continue to moderate the expression of these genes. But sexual selection provides a directional push. favoring alleles that contribute to statures. Across millennia, this has influenced average height within populations, subtly nudging human form in response to both survival and attraction. Height also influences mate choice dynamics. In some populations, women prefer men taller than themselves, but only by a certain margin. Too tall may signal increased caloric needs or difficulty navigating the environment. Too short may signal vulnerability or limited strength. Men, conversely, may show preference for women whose height signals health, reproductive capacity, and efficient energy utilization. These mutual selective pressures create a balance, shaping height distributions in subtle but measurable ways. It's fascinating that sexual selection's impact on height can be traced through archaeological evidence. Skeletal remains often reveal sexual dimorphism, consistent differences between male and female stature. Across multiple prehistoric populations, males were often noticeably taller than females, a pattern maintained in part by sexual selection. Even the relative proportions of limbs and torso can indicate traits valued for attraction and social signaling. Height, then, is both biological and behavioral, a trait selected for by survival needs and social dynamics alike. Sexual selection also intersects with modern perceptions and social psychology. Tall individuals are often perceived as more competent, dominant, and socially influential. These perceptions, in turn, affect opportunities for mating and reproduction, reinforcing evolutionary patterns in contemporary societies. Even subtle cues, like posture or the visual impression of height, can influence social interactions and mate selection. Humans continue to respond to height as a signal, demonstrating that sexual selection is not just an ancient force, it is ongoing. Finally, it's important to emphasize that sexual selection does not act in isolation. It interacts with genetics, climate, nutrition, and disease. A taller male in a malnourished population may not reach his potential. A genetically predisposed short individual in a resource-rich environment may grow taller. Sexual selection provides the preference, but the environment writes the reality. Height is therefore the outcome of a complex dialogue between biology, culture, and survival, with sexual selection serving as one of its most compelling voices. In essence, height is both functional and symbolic. It represents health, strength, and survival capability. It signals reproductive potential, social influence, and cultural perception. Across tens of thousands of years, sexual selection has reinforced certain height traits, ensuring that they persist in the human population while still leaving room for incredible diversity. Every inch of human stature carries echoes of attraction, adaptation, and the subtle choices that shaped reproduction in prehistoric and historic societies. When you consider why some humans are taller and others shorter, sexual selection reminds us that evolution is not just about survival against nature, it's also about survival in social and reproductive arenas. Height is as much a product of attraction and choice as it is of genes and diet. It is a living testament to the ancient interplay between biology, society, and desire, a subtle, ongoing narrative written in every human form. By the time humans reached the modern era, height was no longer shaped only by the slow grind of evolution or the pressures of survival in prehistoric landscapes. The rapid rise of urbanization and the transformation of lifestyle over the past few centuries introduced new, powerful influences on human stature. Cities, technology, and modern living conditions created environments vastly different from the savannas, forests, and ice age plains where our ancestors first evolved, producing unexpected shifts in growth patterns and height variation. The story begins with the Industrial Revolution, a turning point in human lifestyle. Populations moved from rural villages into rapidly expanding cities, drawn by jobs in factories, markets, and construction. This migration concentrated humans in densely populated areas, creating both opportunities and challenges. Nutrition became more predictable for some. Access to markets meant regular food supply. But for the working poor, urban life often brought limited, monotonous diets and overcrowded living conditions. Diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid spread more easily, and sanitation lagged far behind population growth. In many early industrial cities, average heights initially stagnated or even declined despite technological progress. Urbanization also changed physical activity, whereas rural populations or foragers spent hours walking, climbing, and hunting daily. City dwellers often performed repetitive labor, standing at looms, lifting materials, or shoveling coal. The variety and intensity of movement changed, which had subtle effects on musculoskeletal development. Bones, shaped by stress and strain during growth, adapted to these new activity patterns. Taller individuals still existed, but height began to reflect not only genetic potential, but also the constraints of urban nutrition, disease, and labor conditions. One of the most profound effects of urbanization on height is nutritional. Cities brought access to processed foods, imported grains, and eventually animal products from far-off farms. Wealthier families could afford diverse diets rich in protein, vitamins, and minerals, while poorer families often subsisted on bread, potatoes, or cheap grains, lacking essential nutrients. This inequality produced noticeable differences in height within the same city. Schools, hospitals, and census records from the 19th and early 20th centuries show stark variations in stature between social classes. Height became not just a biological feature, but a socioeconomic indicator, reflecting access to nutrition, healthcare, and a safe environment. Beyond diet, urbanization introduced environmental stressors that impacted growth. Pollution, overcrowding, and limited sunlight affected physical development. Lead exposure, air pollution from coal burning, and waterborne pathogens had subtle but measurable effects on skeletal growth. Children living in cramped, poorly ventilated homes often experienced stunted growth due to repeated illness, inadequate nutrition, and the physiological costs of chronic stress. Height, in this sense, became a marker not only of genetics, but of the quality of life during childhood. The 20th century brought dramatic changes. Advances in medicine, public health, and sanitation transformed the urban landscape. Vaccinations, antibiotics, and clean water drastically reduced childhood mortality and disease burden. School lunches and improved access to diverse foods enhanced nutrition. Over just a few generations, average heights in industrialized nations began to rise. Dutchmen, for example, are among the tallest in the world today, a result not of recent genetic changes, but of optimal nutrition, healthcare, and living conditions over multiple generations. Height became a reflection of societal progress as much as biology. Lifestyle changes also shaped growth indirectly through physical activity and exercise patterns. Sedentary urban living in some contexts can reduce musculoskeletal development, while organized sports, fitness programs, and active commuting can promote optimal bone and muscle growth. Modern humans are subject to trade-offs, less physical strain than foragers, but more controlled nutrition and medical care. These factors combine to allow many individuals to reach or exceed their genetic height potential, though extremes in either sedentary lifestyle or malnutrition can still limit growth. Urbanization also facilitated genetic mixing, further influencing height. Cities became melting pots, drawing people from diverse regions, climates, and ancestral backgrounds. Intermarriage and migration increased the diversity of height-related alleles within urban populations. Over time, these genetic mixtures, combined with improved nutrition and reduced disease burden, created populations with taller averages and broader height ranges. Urban environments accelerated the convergence of different genetic and environmental factors that once evolved slowly in isolated communities. Interestingly, height continues to act as a social marker in modern cities, echoing ancient patterns of sexual selection and dominance. Taller individuals are often perceived as more authoritative, healthier, or more attractive, influencing social opportunities and mate choice. In urban populations, these social dynamics reinforce subtle evolutionary pressures, even in a world where survival no longer depends on raw physical strength. Height, in this sense, bridges ancient selective pressures and modern social perceptions. Globalization has magnified these effects. Modern food systems now allow children in previously undernourished regions to grow taller within a single generation, demonstrating the immense power of lifestyle and nutrition. Conversely, urban poverty, food insecurity, and inequality can still stunt growth despite the abundance of modern technology. Height remains both a biological and social mirror, reflecting the interplay of lifestyle, environment, and inherited potential. Finally, urbanization illustrates a profound truth. Human height is not static, it is dynamic, responsive to changing conditions, and intricately linked to the environment in which people grow. From the hunter-gatherer savannas to the crowded factories and skyscrapers of modern cities, the forces that shape stature are evolving with society itself. Diet, disease, activity, and social structures, all intertwined with urban life, leave their mark on bones and bodies, continuing the story that began tens of thousands of years ago with our earliest ancestors. In conclusion, urbanization and lifestyle changes demonstrate that height is as much a product of our environment as of our genes. The cities we build, the food we eat, the diseases we prevent, and the activities we engage in, all these factors continue to shape human growth. Height is a living record of adaptation, survival, and the human journey, reflecting both ancient pressures and modern realities. In every skyscraper, market, and playground, the echoes of evolution continue, silently influencing how tall we become, and what our bodies reveal about our lives. When we think about what influences human height, the mind often goes first to genetics, diet, and disease. Yet, beyond these factors lies a vast and intricate set of environmental pressures, subtle, persistent, and powerful. Among them, altitude, sunlight, and temperature play surprisingly influential roles in shaping human stature and body proportions. To understand why some humans are taller and others shorter, we must look not just at what people eat or inherit, but at how the environment physically molds growth from infancy through adolescence. Let's begin with altitude. Populations living at high elevations face unique challenges. Oxygen levels decrease as altitude rises, creating hypoxic conditions that place stress on developing bodies. High altitude adaptation is a fascinating evolutionary story, and it subtly influences height in regions like the Andes, Himalayas, and Ethiopian highlands. Populations tend to have shorter, stockier bodies with barrel-shaped torsos. This body shape reduces the distance oxygen must travel through tissues, improves lung efficiency, and conserves energy. Crucial adaptations when the air itself contains less oxygen. It's important to note that these adaptations are not just about short stature, they are about proportion. Limbs tend to be shorter relative to the torso, which minimizes surface area and helps retain oxygen more efficiently. Taller, longer limbed bodies, common in equatorial lowlands, would struggle in high altitude conditions. Here, environment directly shapes skeletal development, illustrating that height is not a single trait, but a dynamic feature molded by survival pressures. Sunlight is another hidden influencer of growth. Beyond its role in regulating circadian rhythms and mood, sunlight drives the production of vitamin D in the skin. Vitamin D is essential for calcium absorption and healthy bone development. Populations living at high latitudes or in areas with limited sun exposure historically faced challenges in synthesizing sufficient vitamin D. In such regions, shorter, stockier builds with more compact bones may have been evolutionarily favored, as smaller skeletal structures require less vitamin D for proper development. Conversely, populations in sun-rich regions benefit from greater vitamin D availability, supporting longer limbs, taller stature, and more expansive skeletal growth. Sunlight interacts closely with diet. In prehistoric northern climates, where sunlight was limited for months each year, populations relied heavily on vitamin D-rich foods such as fatty fish, eggs, or animal liver. Communities that failed to access these nutrients often experienced stunted growth or bone deformities like rickets. Height, therefore, is not merely a product of inherited genes. It is also a reflection of how environmental conditions, nutrition, and sunlight converge during development. Temperature itself, independent of climate, also exerts a subtle but significant influence on human stature. Heat and cold exert pressures that shape limb length, body mass, and overall proportions. In hotter regions, taller and more slender builds are advantageous. Longer limbs increase surface area relative to body volume, allowing excess heat to dissipate more efficiently, a critical adaptation for survival in the tropical sun. In contrast, shorter, Compact bodies in cold environments conserve heat, reducing energy loss and protecting vital organs. These adaptations are beautifully predictable, following ecological rules like Allen's and Bergman's, which describe how body shape correlates with environmental temperature. Even more intriguing is how environmental stressors combine. High altitude cold, for instance, presents dual pressures, oxygen scarcity, and heat conservation. Populations in such regions, like the Himalayan Sherpas, evolved body types that balance oxygen efficiency with thermal retention. Their limbs are proportionally shorter, torsos broader, and stature moderate, a harmonious compromise dictated by the environment. Each population's average height is therefore a living record of the pressures exerted by temperature, oxygen, and even sunlight availability over generations. Environmental factors also interact with epigenetics, the chemical switches that regulate gene expression. Chronic stress from extreme temperatures, low oxygen, or limited sunlight can influence hormonal pathways involved in growth. For example, reduced oxygen can affect the secretion of growth hormone and insulin-like growth factor, subtly slowing bone elongation. Limited sunlight can reduce vitamin D levels, impairing calcium metabolism and skeletal density. The result is measurable differences in height, not because genes have changed, but because their expression has been modulated by the environment. Interestingly, environmental impacts on height can manifest within a single generation. Children who grow up at high altitudes or in areas with limited sun exposure often exhibit slower skeletal growth compared to peers in more favorable conditions. These differences may partially normalize if nutrition and environmental access improve, but they highlight how powerful external pressures are in shaping stature. Unlike genetic adaptation, which takes millennia, environmental influences can alter height trajectories over decades, a dynamic interplay of biology and surroundings. Temperature, sunlight, and altitude also intersect with cultural practices. Clothing, shelter, and diet modify the impact of environmental stressors. Populations living in cold, high altitude areas often developed layered clothing and insulated shelters, which allowed some flexibility in body proportions and reduced energy expenditure. Agricultural practices, such as consuming vitamin D rich foods or fortified grains, also mitigate environmental effects. Humans are not passive recipients of environment. Culture actively shapes how environmental pressures translate into physical growth. Moreover, environmental factors can amplify or mitigate genetic predispositions. A genetically tall individual growing in a high altitude, low sun environment may not reach their full potential if environmental conditions limit nutrient absorption or oxygen delivery. Conversely, a genetically shorter individual in an optimal sun, temperature, and nutrition environment may surpass expectations. Height, therefore, is a conversation between inherited potential and the physical realities of the world we inhabit. The subtlety of these effects is part of what makes human variation so fascinating. While climate explains broad patterns of stature, tall in warm regions, short in cold, finer details like altitude, sunlight exposure, and temperature extremes shape height locally, producing regional diversity within continents. In some cases, populations living at similar latitudes may differ significantly in height due to these additional environmental factors, highlighting how adaptive and responsive the human body truly is. Ultimately, altitude, sunlight, and temperature remind us that height is not simply a matter of genes or diet alone. It is a dynamic trait shaped by a multitude of pressures over lifetimes and generations. Every inch of stature is a reflection of the environment in which we grow, the oxygen in the air, the light on our skin, the heat we endure. Human height is a living record of adaptation, a testament to the remarkable ways our bodies negotiate the demands of the world around us. When we look at the diversity of human forms today, tall, short, long-limbed, compact, we are witnessing the intricate interplay of environment and biology. Each population's average height is a subtle map of altitude, sunlight, temperature, diet, disease, and history. In this way, the environment is not just a backdrop for human life, it is an active sculptor, quietly shaping bones, limbs, and stature across generations. Height is, quite literally, the measure of humanity's ongoing dialogue with the world it inhabits. If genetics is the blueprint and environment is the sculptor, childhood is the workshop, the critical period where height is actively built, shaped, and sometimes constrained. While we often think of adult stature as a fixed feature, the journey to full height is a dynamic, multi-stage process that begins at conception and continues through adolescence. Understanding how childhood development and growth spurts determine final height reveals just how finely balanced the forces of biology, environment, and nutrition really are. The process begins in utero. Fetal growth sets the initial trajectory for height, influenced by both genetics and maternal health. Adequate nutrition, oxygen delivery, and absence of maternal illness are critical in this stage. A developing fetus receives the building blocks of bones, cartilage, and connective tissue from the mother. If these nutrients are insufficient, growth may be stunted even before birth. Research shows that low birth weight is often associated with shorter adult height, indicating that the seeds of stature are sown very early. After birth, childhood presents the first major window for growth. The first 2 years of life are characterized by rapid skeletal and muscular development. Growth hormone, thyroid hormone, and insulin-like growth factor 1, IGF-1, coordinate the elongation of bones, expansion of cartilage, and maturation of organ systems. Nutrition plays an outsized role in this period. Protein, calcium, vitamin D, and essential fatty acids are critical. Even temporary deficiencies can have long-term effects on height. A child who experiences malnutrition or chronic illness during this critical window may never reach their genetic potential, no matter how abundant resources become later. Beyond infancy, growth continues steadily, but more slowly through early childhood. This is often called the slow and steady phase, a period where bones elongate gradually and energy is allocated efficiently across organs, muscles, and the skeletal system. Environmental factors such as sunlight exposure, air quality, and disease burden continue to influence growth. Children in high disease environments often expend energy fighting infections, leaving less available for skeletal elongation. Likewise, chronic stress, common in conditions of poverty, instability, or trauma, can elevate cortisol levels, which inhibits growth hormone and slows bone development. The real dramatic leaps occur during growth spurts, periods of rapid height increase typically associated with childhood and adolescence. One of the most notable occurs around age 2, often referred to as the mini spurt, when children can grow several inches in a short time. This early acceleration is followed by steady growth until the prepubertal period, when growth slows temporarily, creating a plateau in height velocity. It is a complex biological rhythm orchestrated by endocrine signals, nutrient availability, and even sleep patterns. Puberty is the most dramatic growth phase, often doubling the rate of skeletal elongation observed in childhood. In girls, this generally occurs between ages 10 and 14, while in boys, it tends to occur slightly later, between 12 and 16. Growth hormone surges, paired with sex hormones like estrogen and testosterone, trigger rapid expansion of long bones and maturation of growth plates. Height can increase several inches in a single year during this period. The timing, duration, and intensity of the pubertal growth spurt are critical in determining final adult stature. Early or late onset, nutritional status, and chronic health conditions all leave measurable impacts on how tall a person ultimately becomes. Interestingly, the growth spurt is not simply a mechanical elongation of bones. It involves a highly coordinated cellular process. Growth plates, located at the ends of long bones, contain cartilage cells that divide, enlarge, and eventually ossify into solid bone. This process is influenced by a complex interplay of hormones, nutritional signals, and mechanical forces. Physical activity during childhood, running, jumping, climbing, stimulates bone remodeling, making the skeleton stronger and sometimes supporting additional growth. Conversely, prolonged sedentary behavior or understimulation can subtly affect bone density and height outcomes. Sleep is another crucial, often overlooked factor. Growth hormone is primarily secreted during deep sleep, especially in children and adolescents. Inadequate or disrupted sleep reduces the effectiveness of these hormonal surges, potentially slowing growth. Modern research increasingly highlights that children who consistently receive sufficient sleep tend to reach closer to their full genetic height potential than those who do not. Sleep, therefore, acts as a biological amplifier for height, ensuring that the body's blueprint is fully realized during the critical years of development. Disease exposure continues to shape growth throughout childhood. Recurrent infections, from respiratory illnesses to gastrointestinal parasites, divert energy away from growth and toward immune function. Historical and contemporary studies alike show that children in high disease environments often experience stunted growth, even if calorie intake is adequate. Infectious disease, therefore, interacts with diet, genetics, and hormonal regulation, forming a complex web of factors that influence height outcomes. Nutrition during childhood deserves special emphasis. Protein intake, in particular, is closely correlated with skeletal growth. Amino acids serve as the raw materials for muscle, cartilage, and bone. Micronutrients like zinc, magnesium, and vitamin K support bone mineralization and structural integrity. Even small deficiencies can slow growth velocity, reducing the impact of genetic potential. Conversely, diets that provide balanced nutrition, particularly during growth spurts, maximize skeletal elongation, and contribute to taller adult stature. Socioeconomic and environmental conditions during childhood further modulate growth. Access to healthcare, exposure to environmental toxins, and stability in living conditions all influence growth patterns. Children raised in nurturing, resource rich environments with low disease burden and consistent nutrition tend to reach or even slightly exceed historical averages for their population. Those growing up in adverse conditions, famine, chronic illness, or environmental stress, often exhibit stunted growth, sometimes permanently altering height trajectories for an entire generation. Finally, the end of growth is marked by the closure of growth plates during late adolescence. Once these plates ossify completely, height is effectively locked in. By this stage, all the cumulative factors, genetics, diet, disease, activity, environmental pressures, and hormonal signals, have determined final adult stature. Height, therefore, is not the product of a single factor, but the sum total of a lifelong, intricately coordinated developmental process. In essence, childhood is where height is decided. Every meal, every infection, every night of deep sleep, and every bout of physical activity contributes to the final outcome. Growth is both a biological miracle and a fragile process, sensitive to both nurture and nature. Understanding the complexity of childhood development reminds us that human height is not just an inherited trait, but a dynamic result of lifelong interactions between genes, environment, and lifestyle. When we reflect on why some humans are taller or shorter, we must remember adult stature is the endpoint of a meticulously choreographed journey that begins long before puberty, often before birth, and continues through adolescence. Each stage of childhood is a chapter in the story of height, a story written not only in DNA, but in every meal, every breath, and every moment of growth. To understand human stature is to witness the incredible orchestration of biology and environment, culminating in the unique form of each individual. Height is not just about bones or diet, it is fundamentally orchestrated by hormones, the chemical messengers that tell the body when, how, and where to grow. Among these, growth hormone, GH, is the star conductor. Secreted by the pituitary gland, GH stimulates bone elongation, cartilage development, and overall tissue growth. Its effects are amplified by insulin-like growth, factor 1, IGF-1, which mediates the proliferation of cells in the growth plates at the ends of long bones. Without these hormones acting in concert, even the best nutrition and optimal genetics cannot produce full height potential. Puberty is the second critical hormonal period for height. During this time, sex hormones, estrogen in girls and testosterone in boys, trigger rapid skeletal growth. Growth plates respond to these hormones, initiating the adolescent growth spurt. Interestingly, estrogen plays a dual role. It promotes bone elongation initially, but eventually leads to growth plate closure, which ends height increase. Testosterone contributes to prolonged growth in boys, often allowing them to surpass girls in adult height despite starting puberty later. The timing and intensity of these hormonal surges are major determinants of final stature. Hormonal levels are sensitive to nutrition and health. Malnutrition, chronic stress, or illness can suppress GH secretion, slowing growth even in genetically tall individuals. Conversely, adequate protein, micronutrients, and regular sleep enhance hormonal function, allowing growth plates to reach their maximum potential. This explains why children in resource rich environments often grow taller than their counterparts with the same genetic potential but harsher living conditions. Hormones act as the interface between environment and genes, translating external conditions into skeletal development. Height is also a mirror of social conditions. Throughout history, socioeconomic status has strongly influenced stature because wealth and social position affect nutrition, disease exposure, and overall well being. Children born into affluent families tend to grow taller, benefiting from consistent diets rich in protein, vitamins, and minerals. They also experience lower disease burden, better sanitation, and greater access to healthcare, all of which reduce growth limiting stressors. Conversely, populations in poverty often show shorter average height, limited access to nutrient dense foods, crowded living conditions, and higher exposure to infections all act to constrain growth. Historical studies of industrial cities, such as 19th century London or early 20th century New York, reveal that working class children were measurably shorter than their wealthier peers. These differences persisted even when genetics were similar, illustrating the powerful effect of environment on stature. Socioeconomic factors also influence the expression of sexual dimorphism in height. In environments where nutrition and healthcare are adequate, males may reach significantly taller heights than females, reflecting full genetic potential. In contrast, in deprived environments, both sexes may exhibit stunted growth, and the typical male advantage in height diminishes. This demonstrates that social and economic context can override genetic predispositions, shaping the physical form of entire populations. Diet is not merely a biological necessity, it is also a cultural artifact shaped by tradition, geography, and availability. Across human history, cultural practices surrounding food have had profound effects on height. Populations consuming protein rich diets with adequate micronutrients, such as calcium and vitamin D, have historically reached taller statures. Dairy consumption in Northern Europe, seafood in coastal populations, and legume rich diets in other regions all provided the nutritional foundation for skeletal growth. Conversely, cultures reliant on single staples with low nutrient density, such as maize or cassava, without proper supplementation, often experienced stunted growth. This was not due to genetics alone, but to the limitations imposed by the diet, which lacked sufficient protein, vitamins, or minerals needed for optimal bone development. Cultural habits, such as food preparation, fermentation, or fortification, could mitigate these limitations, enhancing height outcomes over generations. Furthermore, food scarcity and feast famine cycles shaped population height historically. Communities experiencing chronic scarcity produced shorter adults, while those with stable, diverse food sources encouraged taller growth. Cultural reverence for certain foods or taboos also influenced nutrition. Height, therefore, is not only a biological trait, but a reflection of cultural adaptation, dietary knowledge, and the creative solutions societies developed to meet nutritional needs. While tall stature can offer advantages. Evolution rarely favors extremes without cost. Height is a balance between survival, reproduction, and energy efficiency. Taller bodies require more calories to maintain, placing a burden on energy-limited environments. Longer limbs and larger mass can increase susceptibility to injury or make survival in harsh climates more challenging. In some contexts, shorter, more compact bodies were actually advantageous, conserving heat in cold regions or requiring fewer resources during periods of scarcity. These evolutionary trade-offs explain why human height varies so widely across populations. In equatorial regions, taller, leaner bodies evolved to dissipate heat efficiently, whereas in Arctic or high altitude regions, shorter, stockier bodies retained warmth and maximized energy efficiency. Height is therefore not inherently better or worse, it is context dependent. Evolution favors forms that increase the likelihood of survival and reproduction in a given environment, illustrating that our physical diversity is a record of adaptation, compromise, and strategy. Over the past century, populations in developed countries have seen dramatic increases in average height, a phenomenon known as the secular trend. Improved nutrition, healthcare, sanitation, and reduced disease burden allow children to reach closer to their full genetic potential. Protein-rich diets, fortified foods, and vitamin supplementation contribute significantly, while public health measures reduce infections that historically stunted growth. This trend demonstrates how environmental improvements can rapidly influence height across generations. For example, Dutch men, now among the tallest globally, benefited from consistent dairy consumption, high quality protein, and stable living conditions over several generations. Height is therefore not fixed. It remains responsive to changes in lifestyle, diet, and public health, reflecting the powerful interplay between biology and modern environment. Human height varies dramatically worldwide, reflecting the interplay of genetics, environment, and cultural practices. Populations in Northern Europe, particularly the Netherlands and Scandinavia, are among the tallest, influenced by both genetic predisposition and high protein diets. In contrast, certain Southeast Asian and Andean populations are shorter on average, shaped by historical nutritional constraints, high altitude adaptation, and environmental pressures. These variations are not random, but reflect complex patterns of adaptation, heat dissipation, cold retention, diet, disease exposure, and migration all leave measurable imprints on stature. Height maps provide a unique lens through which we can view human history. They reveal migration routes, environmental adaptation, and cultural innovation. Each population's average height is a living record of survival strategies, ecological adaptation, and the enduring influence of both nature and nurture. Height is strongly influenced by genetics, with hundreds of genes contributing to skeletal growth, hormone regulation, and metabolism. Variants in genes such as FGFR3, HMGA2, and GH1 impact bone elongation, growth plate activity, and growth hormone production. No single gene determines height. Instead, it is the combined effect of multiple genetic factors interacting with environmental inputs. This polygenic influence explains why siblings with similar parents can differ in stature and why populations exhibit distinct average heights. Genetic diversity also interacts with migration and interbreeding. Historical mixing of populations, such as the union of Homo sapiens with Neanderthals, introduced height-related alleles that persist today. Height is therefore both a personal and population-level record of ancestry, showing how evolutionary pressures, migration, and gene flow have shaped human form over tens of thousands of years. Even in adulthood, lifestyle factors can subtly influence final height, particularly through their effects during critical growth periods. Physical activity stimulates bone development and strengthens growth plates. Children and adolescents who engage in weight-bearing exercise, sports, or even regular outdoor play tend to optimize their growth potential. Conversely, prolonged sedentary lifestyles can limit musculoskeletal development. Sleep is another critical factor. Growth hormone peaks during deep sleep, so consistent, sufficient rest is essential for children and adolescents to reach their full height potential. Chronic stress, on the other hand, elevates cortisol, which can inhibit growth hormone function and slow skeletal development. Modern lifestyle choices, diet, exercise, sleep, and stress management therefore continue to shape human height in ways both subtle and significant. Certain medical conditions can dramatically influence height. Hormonal disorders, such as growth, hormone deficiency, hypothyroidism, or precocious puberty, can lead to stunted or accelerated growth. Genetic syndromes, including Turner syndrome, Marfan syndrome, or achondroplasia, also affect stature, sometimes creating extreme shortness or tallness. Early diagnosis and medical intervention can mitigate some effects, illustrating how modern medicine interacts with human growth. Height is not solely a product of genes and environment. It is also influenced by biological events and medical conditions that may accelerate, delay, or inhibit normal development. Understanding these influences highlights how height is both a natural outcome and a complex, multifactorial trait shaped by biology, medicine, and environment. In today's world, height is shaped by an intricate web of environmental, lifestyle, and genetic factors acting together. Modern humans live in diverse climates, consume a vast variety of foods, and experience dramatically different social and economic conditions. Each of these elements interacts with genetic predisposition to produce the final height of an individual. For example, a child with genes for tall stature may still be stunted by poor nutrition, repeated illness, or high stress levels, while a genetically shorter child in a resource-rich environment may surpass ancestral height averages. Urbanization and globalization have intensified these interactions. Access to clean water, fortified foods, vaccination programs, and regular health care reduces environmental pressures that historically limited growth. At the same time, sedentary lifestyles and processed diets create new challenges. Height today is no longer simply a reflection of ancestral adaptation or local ecology. It is a real-time result of ongoing environmental conditions, societal choices, and global trends. Human stature has become a living record of both history and modern lifestyle. Looking ahead, human height will continue to evolve in response to environmental, cultural, and genetic factors. In high-income countries, populations are already reaching unprecedented averages due to improved nutrition, healthcare, and reduced disease burden. In contrast, regions facing food insecurity, poor sanitation, or persistent disease pressures may experience slower gains in height or stagnation. Migration and genetic mixing will continue to blur historical height patterns, producing increasingly diverse populations. Emerging research also suggests that epigenetic factors, chemical changes that influence gene expression, may allow human growth to respond to environmental conditions within a single generation. Height could therefore become even more responsive to nutrition, stress, climate, and lifestyle factors, reflecting both global inequalities and the effectiveness of public health initiatives. Understanding these trends underscores how human height is not fixed, but a dynamic measure of biological, environmental, and societal conditions. Height is not just a number, it's a living record of humanity's journey, a story written in bone, muscle, and the invisible pressures of life itself. Every human body tells this story, quietly testifying to survival, adaptation, and the endless negotiation between nature and nurture. So now, with a smile on your face, you will have a good understanding of why some humans are taller, why others are shorter, and how our prehistoric ancestors, environments, diets, and modern lifestyles all played a part in shaping this simple yet profound trait. It's time to relax. Let these insights drift through your mind and enjoy a peaceful night of sleep. Goodbye, dear friend. See you next time.